We have the 3 of the 4, and we know that Ken is not going to be able to join us. So for the official record, this is the rezoning or the zoning revisioning committee, depending on who you talk to. And it's a subcommittee that has been asked to draft some language to bring back to a joint meeting of the city council and the planning board to what a zoning or a zoning revisioning committee could look like in terms of members and makeup and appointments and all that. So there are 4 of us. Ken Georgie from the planning board is not with us right now. And we have been discussing amongst ourselves, as well as with folks from other groups who had some insight or some thoughts they wanted to share. We had a meeting, our last meeting, which was, I can't remember when that was that in June 30th?
There you go.
End of June, okay. And we met with representatives of the Ward 3 Neighborhood Association as well as Joel Russell. And this afternoon we're with Alex Gieslin, who is representing himself but is also a member of the Best Practices Committee.
And the Bay State Village Association.
Yeah.
They have some official representation from there.
And so I just did that by way of orientation. I know we have some filming apparatus on, so that's who we are, what we're meeting. And actually, this is a chairless body. We've just been meeting, but I did that just for orientation and get us going. And so, do you want to, since you're the main item on the agenda, I do know that there's a, the Ward 3 Association has a statement they want to read as response of the last meeting's discussion, but do you want to start with your thoughts, or?
I think that I'm going to say a lot of the same things that Joel said. I didn't hear what he said, but I'm, from the Best Practices Committee point of view, and also from the from Bay State Village Association, I really hope that the membership of the rezoning committee includes, either among its original membership, people skilled and interested and believing in community dialogue. I really think that part of the solution is to really involve the community somehow in presenting what the problem is and asking what the solution will be. I really think that something as important as what you're undertaking, kind of a zoning vision of sustainability, the sustainability plan, Sustainable Northampton, it really needs to get people on board. The sustainability plan is a good start, a good document. I don't think people have much of a feel for it, what it means in particular. It's a general concept. But as you know, we're planning to hold a public session on the Meadows rezoning, which happened about 3 years ago, all over a period of about 1.5 years, started about 4 years ago, as one of the models of how you go about hearing from the community and hearing what they have to say and answering that and building a public dialogue so that people feel included, feel part of the solution. I think that those are real skills, and I'm hoping that you will recruit either people for the committee or else bring in some sort of subcommittee, some other group that's really skilled at doing that and really spend. And I would really urge you to go slow, to make sure that people understand what you are talking about. As somebody who was on the Zoning Board of Appeals for a number of years, and then on the City Council dealing with zoning, the people don't, it's one of those areas that people just sort of cloud over. It just doesn't register, and it needs to. And there's no reason it shouldn't. It's not that complicated. It's just sort of, it's written in agate tape in some sort of foreign language. But again, it doesn't need to be. So the expertise, well, you want people certainly on a rezoning board who understand and are competent in zoning issues. You really want interpreters. You want people who can make zoning as real as any other city endeavor.
We talked about maybe having an English teacher on the committee who could help put it into language that most of us couldn't, and then, really engage in.
That's not so far off. Lawrence, the city of Lawrence, has now twice in the last 5 years produced a people's budget. They've taken the city budget and reinterpreted it and reformatted it as a document meant to explain, meant not just to record, not for accountants or for the letter of the law, but whose purpose was to explain the budget to people who weren't.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly if you can explain the budget, you should be able to explain the zoning.
Well, and vice versa, I think the sustainability plan is sort of an overview of a vision for the direction the city should go in. But you also need people with experience in the zoning ordinance to understand how that overview needs to be turned into technical language to try and accommodate the goals of the plan. And that's why people with a working knowledge of that document are kind of important, because they can take the general concepts from sustainability and say, okay, how does that translate into required frontage or required area or this or that or whatever, that people who've been served on the zoning board understand a little change here, a little change there may accomplish this. It has to go both ways, both from common English and goals to a more technical language to accommodate those goals in the ordinance. And how does the ordinance work? That's something that perhaps is unique to people that from zoning board or planning board that actually work with the document and know this in zoning language is how you would accomplish the general goals and directions of the sustainability plan or whatever the public wants to do. Because it is kind of, unless you work with it, it is kind of Greek.
Well, from the zoning board of appeals point of view, it's endlessly interpreted.
Mm-hmm.
There are always unforeseen
Mm-hmm.
cubby holes and nooks and crannies into
Mm-hmm.
which you can, with a good lawyer, but also a good argument,
Mm-hmm.
you can interpret.
Mm-hmm.
Alice, can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
You've been on a number of the board, committees and whatnot throughout the city, the zoning board and were you on the transportation
Yeah.
committee too? Do you have kind of a gut feeling how big a committee like this might be, the size or maybe the structure of it that would be workable, that could actually start crafting and developing and moving forward some of these zoning visions? Is it to get the inclusivity that you're talking about, it might be 30 people. But in order to make it manageable, it might only be 7 people.
Well, it's really hard to, it depends on how they, interpret the charge. Again, if you brought in the kind of broad help in specific areas, I'm thinking particularly the public outreach, going out and holding the community meetings and figuring out ways to get people interested in this, going neighborhood to neighborhood, stakeholders, that whole kind of slow process. I don't think that the committee itself needs to do all of those pieces if they're willing to recruit and really foster. Obviously, the smaller the group, the faster things go. Certainly want people who can work sort of have a common vision. But the vision is finding out what the community really wants, what it values, and what it wants to protect, and what it's willing to trade off for that, and then the technical part is mean, it seems to me the easy part is really writing the zoning. I don't think that that's that difficult. If you know what you really want to do. Finding out what you really want to do and what people want to do, I think is going to be very complicated. I know in my neighborhood, I've been involved in the neighborhood association. I've lived on that street, same street for almost 25 years. There's been, in that time, really only one new house built fairly recently. And then there was the Baker Hill development, which is a separate, and they've both had impacts. I know very much that, that green space, whoever it belongs to, becomes sort of the people's park. People, are used to looking at the green space. Certainly I want to see things go slowly. I would really, there's a kind of a scale of change. For 25 years, one new house has come on a street that's about 3/4 of a mile long. That's very incremental change.
Yeah.
We can handle that.
In terms of trying to focus a little bit on what the committee, the mission of the committee is and what it would look like, I'm hearing on a sort of like a scale or a range, some differences and from the various people. And for one initial thought was that we need to recruit people from the community who have an expertise in the various zoning related areas, and that they should be aiding the planning board with their expertise. And so we're not really looking for representatives from the community so much, or even process people. We're looking for people with some credentials and some understanding of different types of aspects related to zoning. And as a matter of fact, my interpretation, I thought Joel was more towards that direction when he spoke with us. And his comments about process, I think he said process should be written into whatever the bylaws for the group is. And, clearly it's important to have that process, but that should be part of the charge that they're given, as opposed to necessarily the people, not process people per se. I don't think he was suggesting that as you were. So there is I think I heard a difference between what you're saying and Joel's saying a little bit. Then there was suggestions that the membership should be a little bit more representative. We should deliberately go out and recruit people who represent the city. So there is sort of like a range, and I think we're going to try to incorporate both of those. I think we're going to try to balance that. But I just wanted to put that out there in the context of what you said. And in response to your last point about the committee, kind of listening to the people, in my listening to folks who have been advising us or giving us opinions, there's at least some thought out there that there's a direction that was given to us by the sustainability plan, that they had some ideas in there, and that we should start with what's in the plan and work from there, and not sort of like reinvent the wheel and not go back and listening to what people want, but start with the plan. Both of those are a little, I think they can be tweaked, but they're very different starting points. So I just wanted to give you that feedback, because I think you're assuming that what you're saying is maybe widely agreed upon, but I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Well, I don't know how widely. I think, though, that the general knowledge of the sustainability plan is pretty small. I would think that a representative group of you,
you were there, right?
You took. We worked with the Florence plan, with the Vision 2020, the documents, and discovered pretty quickly that there was, people, one, didn't agree with them, didn't want to implement some sections of them. There was a section in the zoning that allowed to increase the vibrancy of the street, to allow residents on the first floor in the general business district. But when the first time that actually, the application for that came in Florence, there was, a general outcry that this is not something that we want. We never understood this, didn't know it. And in fact, moved and got the city council to rescind it. And that's the kind of, I think, what you want to avoid, surprising people. So,
I think another example of that, about 4 or 5 years ago, the planning board and the Office of Planning and Development put forth an ordinance that would increase the size of frontages out in Ward 6 and Ward 7. And for whatever reason, didn't really do the groundwork, the talking, in the public beforehand, and just held a public hearing, and the stuff really hit the fan because landowners who own property there, who had plans, didn't have a chance to kind of tease it out and talk about things and see how that was really going to impact their life. I think that is still very relevant to the sustainability plan. People want to see less activity, less residential building out in Ward 6 and Ward 7, more building in town, but how do you phrase that then in languages of ordinances in order to make sure that it accounts for homeowners out there, the landlords? That's that public outreach that I think you're talking about, and it's real clear that that's one of the important ones that people want to see have some language to right away and some teeth to it, I think. So those examples are all good. I think another example is the King Street ordinance. There's probably people who think that the sustainability plan could speak to that ordinance and maybe be tweaked in a way, in a different vision. So there's another example, how that all happens, how you get so much public input into it, at what stage, I'm not really sure yet.
Yeah, just a clarification, and those examples, I think all of those came to the point of actually being written up as proposed ordinances, and 2 of the 3 examples, the one in downtown Florence and the King Street, I think were obviously passed. The one of them later rescinded.
Yeah.
And I think the one in between that you mentioned, do with the frontage, I don't know if that was ever passed. I think that might have stalled somewhere and just never made it forward.
Yeah.
But the question I have, in terms of this committee that we're talking about, where does the responsibility fall, do we think, in terms of organizing those public forums? Are we thinking that this rezoning committee would be holding those forums? Or do we think those forums are the responsibility of some other body? In this question, I don't know, but just to clarify that, are we suggesting that this is like this committee has a major educational responsibility? Or does that responsibility stay with the planning board?
If that's a question that I could take a shot at, and I think Joel addressed that a little bit too. He thought it would be a good process would be for this committee to have a piece of that educational and public input, and take some of that input in from people who have learned, almost like a teach-in about what some of the impacts are, what the language looks like. That's a lot of work. But still, for that core group of the zoning revisiting committee to hear that input and then go back and write draft language that might address the concerns of the people who've spoken, and also the concerns of the sustainability plan, and then bring that to the planning board for the official public hearings. So it was a 2-piece thing, but I thought, and I kind of agree, part of the charge of this committee is to go out and listen to the input from the public, especially on some of these more contentious things where there's a lot of stakeholders.
Sometimes, and I think this is what Alex was hitting on a minute ago, that a philosophical plan like sustainability, I mean, there may have been 300, 400, 500 people that participated in that brainstorming session. It got it got reduced to a document that was accepted. But until that manifests itself as hard changes in your neighborhood, it is a philosophical document that has no impact on you. But until, for instance, we take the concept of transferring development from 6 and 7 to 2, 3, 4, 5, and that manifests itself as the potential for a building lot next to my house, it doesn't have any real relevance for me, and it's not part of my world, it's just this plan. And at that point, I become interested, and I think that's what happened in the Florence plan. Everybody said, oh, philosophically, that's fine, but until it manifests itself as change in my personal world, I didn't really deal with it, but now I did. And I guess the question would be, where does that happen? Does this group take a look at sustainability as the public input document, make the recommended changes to accommodate that, and as a subcommittee of the planning board, and then give it to the planning board and say, these will accomplish that, but it's going to impact different neighborhoods different ways, and then have the planning board actually have the public hearings to say, do you want us to go here or not? And do it at that level, or have this group go around and essentially start the process of first coming up with the idea, and then it's going to affect 5 one way, it's going to affect 6 and 7 another way. Maybe it has no effect on 2 at all, depending on on what exactly the changes are. I'd like to get a handle on actually to what level does the process have to get before certain neighborhoods start to pay attention to it as a reality for them and not just a philosophical discussion. That's kind of the point where my thinking is, how precise is the recommendation going to be before someone actually takes it seriously in their own world?
Exactly.
And let's play that out a little bit with experience. If the rezoning or the zoning revisioning committee goes into the sustainability plan and pulls out a handful of the recommendations to start with, and if they just take them as general recommendations and then go around into the community and have 3 or 4 public meetings on those general recommendations, is that going to be specific enough for people to want to respond and get involved in it? Clearly some will. But do you have to go to the point where they are drafted as specific ordinances and then take them around for feedback? And maybe we have to do both.
I think the interim
Go ahead.
might be the case, because Alex's example of Riverside Drive having 1 lot actually get developed in 25 years, and the potential was there, it just never happened. But if we were able to let's take Bay State and say, most of it's URB. Let's take frontage from 75 feet to 70 feet and a lot size from 8,000 square feet to 6,500 square feet, and let planning then go to their GPS and say, how many lots appear if we do that? Here they are. With that level of manifestation on a plan, then take that and say, here's what 1,500 square feet of area and 5 or 10 feet of frontage, how it would change and impact your neighborhood, not tomorrow, but over the next 10 years as these things start to fall into place. What do you think of that? But I think until you get it to that level, it's really kind of abstract for neighborhoods to say, if you just said you're going to make those changes, they might go, whatever, what's on TV tonight? But if you showed them a map and said that could make this happen, then I think they can realize it and you get some feedback from them. But I kind of think it takes that level to get them to actually, people actually pay attention. It will impact my neighborhood or my, area of interest.
And in the example you just used, you could do that without a specific proposed ordinance. You could say, here's how the idea would play out, and we're still talking about the concept.
Yeah, because I still think there's a lot of, like there was in the Florence plan in 2020, there's a lot of things in there that people didn't really understand what the impact of them could be until it was illustrated to them that way, or until it popped up and then they knee-jerk and they say, oh, we can't do that.
But, and I think then what Alex is saying is that this group then really needs almost like a trained facilitator to say, okay, here's a possible scenario. What are the pros and cons of this? These are the negative impacts that might happen. These are the positive impacts of a reduction in lot sizes. The sustainability plan speaks about walkability, maybe the PVTA now can come into that neighborhood because there's a greater density of mass. You know, where's the political will to say, okay, those positive impacts convince me that, you know, I'll support this change. Or, no, I don't want a neighbor, I don't want Joe Blow to build another house next to me, and he can now, regardless of what it does in PVTA.
Well, and the flip side, which we saw in Ward 7 with the proposed frontage changes, you know, how many lots go away in, you know, so that, yeah, it offsets itself. We lose 25 potential sites out there, we gain 25 infill sites in an area that's sustained by utilities and transportation and all the things that the plan says is a good thing. But what do the natives think when it actually manifests itself?
Well, I think that's a good example. Alex is an example. If I recall the situation correctly, that's a good example of something being put in writing without the idea being discussed with people beforehand. And so
Well, I mean, it wasn't, and in the abstract, I think that David is absolutely correct. And, well, it's also interesting, I mean, the other public example of sort of accumulating effect where the loosening the requirements, the lot size and frontage requirements in first the UR, I think in central business and then URC, and then URB, and they went fairly unnoticed. And it's not clear to me, those past city council, the same was applied to the URA, and an organized voice came out of everywhere and said, no, you can't do this. And in fact, the planning board showed, I think, on a map.
This was around Ward 3, some of those neighborhoods around Smith College, I think, and
Top high.
That'd be Ward what?
Two.
Two, yeah.
Because there's not a lot of A and 2, mostly B and C, I think.
And still, you know, they were just as close to the downtown as any part of URB or USC, but it had a politically organized group of people, and no matter what the philosophical arguments were, they didn't want any more houses built in their area.
Where, I guess another way to ask a question we've kicked around is theoretically at what level do we want that feedback to happen? At the planning board level or at this committee level? Or what, you know, obviously we're going to make a recommendation back to the planning board, who's then, I keep assuming this committee is going to be a unit of the planning board that's going to do the legwork for them. So the planning board will be the parent entity that would vet all of this, and then the planning board would send whatever they did to the council, whatever they recommended. Just the question is this more of a working group with a real public input at the planning board level? Or how do we split the charge for, you do this much public stuff and we'll do the rest, or you work with the public input from sustainability that's already done, and then we'll take it to the level of getting the having the public hearings there. You just work with what's already been done in sustainability and give us some options to accomplish it, and then we'll vet it all out as the planning board, and because
that's what we're going to have to wrestle with when we draft it. But the rough scheme that I have is that this group, this rezoning group, would take the ideas in sustainability, kind of flesh them out a little bit, at least in terms of for public discussion, bring them around and get feedback, and then report or present back.
Feedback from who?
The public, the neighbors that would be affected, and then report them back to the planning department and the planning board, saying, here are the concerns, or here are the possible advantages, or there seem to be, whatever. But I don't see them, writing up. I don't see them going quite that far. I think they give them the raw data that they got, and here's the response, here are the pros and cons, here's the potential problems. Okay.
So not ordinance, just concept.
Yes, and they might even have specific recommendations on it, on parts of the concept, and they might even have their own vote about an idea or whatever.
Yeah.
not writing it up. It's more,
So, and that would be, I think, a lot less threatening to neighborhoods if you went to a neighborhood and said, here's a frontage and area adjustment that would allow infill in your neighborhood. It is not an ordinance, it's just a concept. It doesn't, it's not an ordinance form. Here's the impact if you did that. At what level are you comfortable with the infill this would cause, or this, which stage of change would be the most palatable for the neighborhood? Because any changes like this take time to filter out, 5 years, 10 years till they actually occur. You could make one incremental change and then return and make another at some point in time down the road if change wasn't happening rapidly enough. Like we saw with the downtown architectural district, there was one level of it, and then after 5 years' experience, it got adjusted based on what happened to take out some things that never did happen and add some things that should have happened, and it could certainly be revisited once the framework got set up.
Well, it's been a pattern for the planning department is to act incrementally, but then, once the buildings are built.
You can't take them away, but certainly if it's a loosening of restrictions, you can step into it to let a little change happen and evaluate it and see if you learn anything from that. And then if it's a positive thing, then change the regulations a little, change the nuance a little, let more change happen if people start to grow to be comfortable with it.
Are you familiar with the ordinance that was recently passed that recreated the Energy Resource Committee?
Yes.
You were involved in
Yeah.
that. Well, they had a paragraph in that about the makeup of that committee that I brought, I think at our last meeting, and I referenced. And the language of that, let's see if we can find it now, but it said,
Was fairly, you're talking about the civilian, the
the
citizen
appointments
base,
to it.
people
And
with,
I think I have the first page and the last page, but not the second page. It says 4 members of the public selected to supply, and then it has Cohen, professional experience with energy issues, and then it gives examples of that. Expertise in business, financing, or economic development. So that's another category. And representation of broad-based community interests, and it has some examples of what they mean by that. So of the 4 members of the committee, those are the areas that has to be represented. They don't have to be represented by every one person, but somehow in that composition, they have to reflect those. And so I thought that was at least worth looking at as an example, because I think we're dealing with a similar sort of issue where we want some expertise in obviously zoning, but we also want representation, and we also want people who can have some expertise in doing a facilitation process. So that's sort of, I'm sort of looking at right now is doing kind of a borrowing of that approach and saying here are 3 areas of concern, and X number of members have to reflect these type of areas for the city. Just to put it out there, something to think about.
Yeah, and I think Jim Nash, when he gave us this little treatise, he reflected that same thing, taken almost from the sustainability plan, a representative from the business or industrial community, environmental conservation or open space, a rep from distinctive neighborhoods like Bay State, Ward 3, Leach Civic, and a rep from construction and development. So again, they were thinking of kind of a broad representation, but still with some specific interests that would give all.
And that's a slightly different approach though, because that's more of the assigned seating approach, that we have to have one person that fills this and one person that, and I don't see that as doing the same approach.
Well, I think, Michael, again, maybe if we look at this whole, this circle and all the pieces of the pie that fill it up, I think at one point we talked about an ideal committee would have somebody with some legal background or somebody with some real estate background who knows the impacts of that, somebody with the real zoning language background. I thought we were discussing the characteristics of
Right.
what a board would be. Somebody who's a facilitator, a meeting facilitator.
But in reality, George, people don't wear one hat.
No.
The person who's a lawyer lives in a neighborhood.
Yeah,
And, you know, to say, okay, you're there not as a representative of the neighborhood, but you're there as a lawyer, to me is unrealistic. I don't see that, you know, so you're not there as a person from the Bay State, you're there as a facilitator. I
Right.
mean, people have, it's possible for a lawyer to be a facilitator as well.
Right.
So, I mean, people have all levels of interest and
sure they do,
expertise,
but
so-
what if the group comes together and there's nobody with any legal expertise,
Well, that's-
nobody who's a
the person putting
developer?
together the committee hasn't done their job if it said these are the criteria.
Another, the personal experience I've had was the demolition review ordinance, which got really, went out of their way to get most of the stakeholders in the room. People who really had diametrically opposed, you know, not views, but interests, different interests. And over a, 6-month period, worked it out. If you can get most of the parts of the city represented somehow in the conversation. Again, I don't understand exactly what your vision is for this subcommittee. If in fact you already have, think that there is a consensus on what the direction of the city and that this is mainly implementing that consensus, that's one group of people. If in fact you're taking a very broad philosophical document that really was the product of very, may have involved at one time or another 300 or 400 people, but certainly was a much smaller group than that in most of the time. I don't think the city's far enough along in that conversation to know, and certainly to be able to balance the trade-offs. We have there's no public transportation. There's not much hope of it expanding. It's something I've also been involved in, public transportation and lobbying for it for the last 10 years. And we've seen, in fact, PBTA reduction. We've gone from 11 million rides a year down to 9 million years a ride. We have not, despite state senators' pretty strong attempts, been able to even get it funded. So currently, there's no commitment on the state's part to really build public transportation in Western Mass. It may happen at $4 gas or $6 gas, but it hasn't happened yet, and hasn't happened despite a lot of promises.
One of the things we talked about the last time too was how this committee gets appointed, and one of the approaches was, well, you diversify the appointing authority by saying, one current or former member of the zoning board, so you pick up an understanding and skill there, and perhaps a representative from the planning board, and pick several different entities so that their appointee will have the knowledge that group represents, but that, much like CPA, the 5 constituent bodies appoint their own person, and there is some independence in that, so you can never come back and say, oh, they're all mayoral appointments for the mayor, cook the books on this committee in advance. That's one way to do it. The other way, what Michael's talking about is then if you're going to cover skill groups that may be in different people, then you do need a central appointing authority so they know, okay, this person brings this and that person brings that, and I know I'm bringing all of these 5, 7, 9 people together, so I cover all of the skill set. But you can only do that if there's one appointing authority, because they're the only ones that would know who brings what to the table. Do you have any opinion or recommendation one way or the other on that one? No?
I'm not sure I follow your example, David. Assuming that the mayor can appoint a group of people who hold various skills, but she's the only one appointed. But the planning board itself could recruit, but the same men would know that they were pulling. But again, it's one body. True, it's one body that's doing all the appointing.
Yeah. So with Mike, with your approach, that assembling a body of knowledge from different places requires sort of a central appointing authority to make sure you cover all the bases.
Of those particular.
Yeah, of that skill set.
There are other people on the committee.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that would be a sub-pie of the pie, so to speak. If I look, I need to look at things kind of graphically. That's a quarter of the pie.
It's a piece of the pie.
A piece of the pie. You know, that,
But if you go back to the Community Preservation Committee, you know, they have people going into that committee from 7 or 8 different sources. You know, they have 4 appointing committees.
4 or 5, yeah.
4 or 5, then there's the mayor, there's the city council,
And then there's
and
the
then
election.
2 are
Right.
elected from the public.
Right.
Yet, it's seemingly a very successful committee and with a wide range of talent, and they cover all the bases. And so, I mean, there's another possible, if we're looking for committees on the books, we have a couple of different models to look at.
what's different, I just want to go back to Alex's example about, say, public transportation. So one of the zoning recommendations might have a lot to do with that. It doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be an advocate who's carrying that banner on the committee, but you would hope when there's the public outreach in a meeting that those advocates come to the meeting and their voices are heard, right? As long as they're given that opportunity. Same with, say, conservation. You don't have to have someone who that's their main cause, so to speak, but that there's enough public hearings, enough public outreach that certainly all the conservation groups and those usual suspects, so to speak, are able to provide their input to it. I think, because if we tried to get a representative from each interest in the city, we would just balloon to an enormous committee.
Mhm.
Yeah, and they will, my assumption is they will come, they always do come, the people who have vested interest. It's the other people who don't come to the meetings that are gonna be the real trick, and I think the city has struggled forever to get people from large apartment complexes, people who represent minorities, people who, represent teenagers, things of that nature. That's gonna be the trick.
I would also hope that you would be looking, or that somebody would be looking at, the DPW is the only place I can think of, who really looks at the city from both, water resources, geology, sort of the natural resource, what the city looks like when there's no city there, what the topography is, what's its value, where our,
So to consider the natural environment as well as the built environment.
Yeah.
Just look at the city as.
the city has, detailed expertise in a lot of areas, and we ought to be certainly tapping that
Mhm.
sort of basic knowledge of geology and topography.
No, and they do, a lot of times DPW ends up having to be reactionary to things because no one thinks to include their perspective when something gets put together. So they end up, somewhere down the line, they get sent a draft and ask for a position, and they can unravel a lot of work with very logical observations that maybe we should have asked them at the beginning rather than at the end. Because they get involved very late in the process.
Well, a follow-up on something that you said early on, when you were talking about this committee going out and doing a lot of public outreach. And then you made the comment is that they wouldn't necessarily have to do it themselves, but they may have a volunteer base of people willing to do that. Did you have something specific in mind? Are there other examples? Because when you were saying that, I was trying to think of existing committees in the city that has sort of like a group of enthusiastic followers who do their work for them.
It's not.
And if there is one, I want to get on that committee.
Well, I think that the Best Practices Committee, the first forum, recruited a group of people who were not on the committee who were very interested in public forums and in producing them. It was a small group of people. But there are a lot of environmental, the energy, there was a broad base of volunteer help for raising people's consciousness about energy and climate change that happened in the early 2000s that were not really reflected at all. I mean, the mayor never reappointed the Energy Commission, but those people continued to work and proselytize and organize.
But I think you're right, Michael. I think the planning board or the Office of Planning Development has been most successful when they have some interns or somebody who can actually walk around the streets with handbills and stuff doors about notices of a public hearing or coming together for a forum, you know.
And I do think in the last 5 years, the neighborhood associations, I mean, Florence Civic has been around for 60 years, Bay State Village has been around, but they've grown, and I've been very encouraged at the meetings of neighborhood associations that they've been kind of getting together. They seem to have become much more vibrant than they were 5 years ago as far as, you know, sort of flexing their muscle in their neighborhood and saying, hey, you know, we have an opinion on this, and
Come on out.
you know,
Tomorrow night at 7 o'clock.
right,
Yeah.
and let's talk about this. So that certainly is an advantage to us, that there's those mechanisms in place to get public opinion, or just forums to go to say, you know, if you go to Bay State Village, Florence Civic, or to Ward 3, they get a group for you, which is a good thing. I know
Yes.
people have something to say.
It's also my perception that the planning board has a fairly large database of interested, on their email list where they
Right.
send out emails, and they've accumulated a lot
Yeah.
of names and addresses. Is that correct?
Yeah.
For that, so.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that works, Michael. I think it's more that the listservs, they have these, there's so many listservs now out there that people are plugged into. But you're right, even like the CPA, all that announcement and news goes out to people. If you want to read it, that's great, and people can subscribe to that, so that's.
Because on the website, there's one of the things somebody can sign up for
Yeah.
is
There's
the,
that listserv, yeah. So that's something certainly this zoning group could look at also.
okay, last shot, Alex, anything you want to add?
No, it's a very complicated endeavor.
Yeah. Would you be willing to serve if so requested?
No, but I'd certainly be willing to
No.
work in my neighborhood. In my neighborhood, I would definitely be interested. The Bay State Village Association, as
Yeah.
David says, is it's a nucleus. It's not as any of those associations, a small group of people,
Yeah.
but we have in common geography and history.
And it depends on the topic.
Yeah.
You know, if it's get together and talk about some esoteric zoning thing, you might get a smaller group than we're having a field day and come have a picnic and play ball. I mean, it depends on the issue to who comes, but the network is certainly there for people who want to come, to know that it's happening and come take a look.
We have our own listserv, our own webpage.
Yeah, so, you know, it's gonna be interesting, it's so hard to be black and white about the process, because depending upon the issue, whether it's King Street, or whether it's Ward 6 and 7, or whether it's downtown Florence, the process of public outreach and who's gonna be outreach is gonna be different. So we're not gonna be able to pin it down exactly, other than saying that, you know, we are gonna make our best effort around the public outreach, and I think everybody has said that across the board.
Thank you, Alex.
My pleasure.
You're certainly welcome to stay.
No,
This is a
no,
public meeting. Do we want to turn it over to these folks who had a little
Yes.
statement themselves?
Yes, I'm interested in hearing.
Come in front of the camera.
Yeah, sure, why not? I want to be the disembodied voice here. So this is from the study group. The decision of how the rezoning committee will work and who will be on it is the first major step towards making significant changes to the value, look, and feel of Northampton. Some changes in city regulations affect the city's economic, environmental, and demographic makeup. The rezoning committee will affect the city as a whole, but making this facile acknowledgement overlooks the manner of changes suggested by the future land use map and the character of the work charged to the rezoning committee. The future land use map offers an image of what the future of Northampton could be, and the appendix offers many regulations that may or may not guide us to such a future. The changes suggested in the appendix and reflected on the map have a general tenor to provide ways of growing the denser areas, conserving or preserving the less dense ones. Since most conservation and preservation involve little or no change in the status quo, it's clear that the largest and most dramatic changes coming from the rezoning committee will affect the denser communities. The urban centers and traditional neighborhoods that are all around the city give Northampton a distinctive character and quality that the Sustainable Northampton Plan tries to preserve as well as grow and fill in. If the Rezoning Committee is successful, it will have done the following. Suggest a mix of regulations that provide for growth in Northampton without giving up what makes Northampton distinctive. This charge is difficult because it puts the Rezoning Committee in a constant feedback loop with the communities with the communities it represents. This is the crux of the reasoning behind asking both city officials and community representatives. A rezoning committee that doesn't give community representatives full voting power risks being unresponsive to the balance of interests that is required for maintaining Northampton's unique character. The rezoning committee will be dealing with large and difficult issues and cannot also be required to build consensus among economic, environmental, and social groups about what makes them distinctive and worth preserving. Nor can the rezoning committee assume to know the right balance. Instead, these groups must be allowed to build their own consensus and provide a representative to the rezoning committee who holds the balance sheet of their opinions. Ward 3 Neighborhood Association Sustainable Northampton Study Group has prepared a plan that calls on communities within the city to send nominations for their representative, the business community, environmental groups, the neighborhood. Therefore, we strongly urge this committee to consider our proposal. Sincerely, Ward 3 Sustainable.
Thank you. I've kind of volunteered as the clerk of the board here, so I'll keep this for the future manila envelope that
Before you go, unrelated, did you from your days at Dartmouth know Dick Dills?
Dills?
Dills, Richard Dills. I think he was there about the time you were.
I'm not familiar, but I'm
Okay,
losing
that's okay.
losing my long-term as well as short-term memory.
so
My mother tells me that makes you much happier.
I think so.
Make her much happier.
I can't remember all the things about it, right?
Yes, she doesn't.
Every day is a brand new experience.
Every day is
Never meet the same
Out of new
nice people
discoveries.
over and over again.
the same nice one.
Thank you very much,
Okay,
gentlemen.
thanks.
See you, Alan.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So how are we doing for time right now? I don't know what that
that's
is.
where it was.
Just about 6.
About 6.
One proposal would be to kind of start just fleshing out what we think the components of our little proposal to the full board might be. What are we looking at? The full-blown ordinance, proposed ordinance like that Energy Sustainability Committee or something else? I bring that up because one of the things I was just read on the record sentence is a rezoning committee that doesn't give community representatives full voting power risks being unresponsive to the balance of interest. So I think we need to kind of describe what is the power, so to speak. Are votes being taken by the zoning, or are they just providing, proposals to the planning board and then on to the city council?
Well, they would need presumably to take a vote on what is being proposed, or if they're being proposed with an endorsement or a non-endorsement or something like that.
But these are proposals for recommendations.
Right.
That then go to the planning board as recommendations that get vetted again. That then go to the city council as proposed ordinances that get vetted again. So it's a kind of a 3-tier thing. Just from the planning board's perspective, we're going to report back to the planning board. At some point prior to doing that, should we go, if we develop specific questions in our process, should we go to the planning board and say, okay, we've done outreach to different groups, we're looking for a direction, and since, you're our mentor and our host official organization, what do you see? What do you want from us? There's 2 schools of thought. It could be a 13-member all-encompassing thing, or it could be a 7-member, more streamlined we at the planning board want to do the other part, so you just get things on the table and we're gonna vet them. Would it make sense, you know, we also don't have 10 here, so I don't think we want to do too much in ink.
Right.
Should we go ask and then, now that we've gathered and done our outreach and get some direction?
Yeah, mechanically, that makes sense to me,
Mhm.
because we don't want to go to a double public meeting and kind of lay this out for the first time to people.
Mhm.
We've already had brief conversations, Ken and I, with the planning board at the end of the night as a piece of the other business under the agenda, just what we're doing, what our discussions have been like. So it makes sense to me that we run by some kind of draft to them and get some feedback from those members who are gonna be doing. And I think it would be the same at the city council end also.
So we would run a draft by them in public session, obviously.
Yep.
Separately, but not together.
Right, and solicit input from them that then maybe we
Okay.
take back one more time to tweak our
Finalize
document
it, right.
before we bring it to the joint. Yeah.
And because, you know, and even when I look at the council's input to this, there's a major step in the food chain before it gets to us, which is planning board.
Right.
And what role does that full board want to retain for itself? And what kind of report does it, you know, does it want this committee to do, and what does it want to do itself? You know, if the next time this council sees it, it's gonna be when it's kind of looking like an ordinance.
Yeah, right.
Well, a draft order.
A draft,
Draft,
yeah,
right.
but it's gonna have achieved that level of
Yeah.
consensus from the planning board at that
Yeah,
point.
Okay.
So it's more, you know, this reports to you, you propose to us, you know, what do you want to get for work product, and what actually is the planning board's vision? And that might be interesting to know before we make our,
yeah.
put a lot of process into it.
But I would recommend that we kind of draft an agenda for our next meeting. Are we meeting a week from today? Is that?
Right.
And then we'll have Ken, and we'll be,
Right.
Again, right, and I would say that we should be prepared for that to be maybe like if not a writing session, it's certainly a drafting session.
Mhm.
And I think there's more than one way to write an ordinance that's creating a body committee. But in this one, on the Energy and Sustainability Committee, it has establishment, purpose, membership terms, chair, filling the vacancies, powers, duties, and functions, meetings, quorum. Those are sort of like the basics.
Right.
So I would say that we do something comparable to that, and using that as an outline, so to speak.
Yeah, and that makes
Start
sense.
drafting.
That makes sense.
At least start focusing ideas and then
Right.
drafting.
yeah. And then perhaps we do that next time, and then you have that to take to brainstorm with the planning board. When do you meet first and all?
Second and fourth of each month, so we'll be meeting again, we're meeting here on the 4th, it probably won't be till
Oh, so if we did it, you could take it with
the
you to,
13th or
yeah.
something, yeah.
and then the goal would be to have it, because I think we all were saying this wasn't gonna actually happen until September, and everybody was back in play and
Right.
from vacations, and so we could be ready.
Yeah, the timing would be pretty good. At one point, we talked about going back to this joint meeting with maybe option A or option B. But then did we come to a consensus that here in this group, we just want to hash out option A as a proposal?
And
Not, a committee of 7 appointed or nominated this way, or a committee of 26 nominated this way.
My guess is that if we went with an A or a B, we would be asked to come back with a C.
Yeah.
To do it anyway, so why don't we
And-
do our best at both?
And then, I mean, we'll have the time, because if you go to planning board the week after we meet, and they go, oh, no, man, you're on left field, then we revisit.
Now, is this something, and I feel like we're way down the road on this, because we haven't even set time to draft something, but would the subgroup present it, or would you and Ken present it, out of curiosity, to the planning board?
That's certainly up to you folks. If you wanted to come, I can't say when, it would probably, You know, I don't know what the permit hearing is like. There's a timing thing there, because usually these happen way at the end of the night, 11 o'clock, 11:30.
Yeah.
Unless we wanted to get on the official agenda and have that. I think that opens up the door then to public comment, which we're not trying to keep the public out of this process, because there's gonna be another place when the ordinance actually goes to public hearing where public's gonna be allowed to comment on it.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly is always helpful when everybody who's been in the preliminary discussions is there to give their perspective, and the notes that we've taken certainly aren't conclusive of all of our discussions. So Ken and I might forget something that you two will remember. So that would be an asset if you two are available.
Yeah, I don't have any trouble with you and Ken bringing it up when it's appropriate, and we'll know what night it is. So I certainly, if I want to come along and be in the audience as a resource, if you feel you need it, I don't mind doing that. But I also know how much we enjoy being there till 11 o'clock at night. So.
No, correct.
Well, let me try this. Let me approach Carolyn then and see what the agenda looks like for the 13th. And then, of course, this is all, let's see how we do
Yeah,
on the next meeting.
Quite frankly, I think that's a little
That might
ambitious.
be ambitious, but I'll look that meeting and the meeting after that.
Yeah,
to see what
and
the
the
agenda is
meeting
like.
in October.
Yeah, I mean, it is, you know, this whole process is getting, I don't want to say it's being ridiculed, that's a little bit strong, but it's being joked about, you know, it's like the committee, preparing a committee for a committee, so everybody does want to see it move along and get done, so. And I think like many things, like we're doing on the CPC, this is the first year of the Community Preservation Committee. We're trying out some things. We're sure we're going to revisit our bylaws and a bunch of things and do it differently next year. We've already made some changes. I would think this committee too is somewhat of a work in progress. So
Let's not do it the way we pick best practices.
through an application process and interviews.
Multiple ballots and,
Oh,
let's not use that
Let's
process.
not use that process.
So I can look through that draft ordinance of the energy and sustainability and just draft like a little template of things to give us something to look at the next meeting.
Yeah, and you can go online and at the city's ordinances and look at the ordinance creating other committees,
Right.
you know, so, but this is the basics. So, I mean,
Yeah.
we need to come up with a purpose. We've been wrestling a lot with membership, and we need to come up with something on membership. And then powers, duties, and functions. And the other things, I think, will fall into place, like filling vacancies and quorums
Yeah.
and stuff, once we determine what the membership is.
And theoretically, I mean, this is a task-oriented committee, and theoretically, it's going to do its job, make its report to its parent, the planning board, and then it's set for the moment.
Yeah, there's going to be some interesting discussion among the planning board members, and this group, I think, about what is fair game for them to consider in the sustainability plan. There's a number of zoning things that the planning board, and we spoke about this at our first meeting, wants to move on or should move on because it doesn't involve a major impact to the city, but who draws that line and says, okay, this doesn't need to go to this rezoning committee, but this one does. That's going to have to be worked out over time also. Some kind of process where the planning board notifies this rezoning committee of the things that they're working on and vice versa. And then again, it's all about how active representatives are on any group. You know, if the planning board rep to this group doesn't always give some kind of dialogue back to the full planning board, you know, you're going to lose something.
In terms of what this rezoning committee would be, have the authority to look at, that point you just raised. My understanding was that anything in the sustainability plan was, at least in theory,
In play.
something that would be fair play for them to want to look at.
Yeah, and I think so too. But I think you could easily say that encompasses the whole universe of zoning
It does.
within Northampton. And they're going to have to prioritize.
Well, yeah, they're going to have to do it, but I don't think anybody does it for them.
No, no.
But that also doesn't stop the planning board from moving on some of those
Right.
issues as they see fit. There's
Right.
nothing that says the planning board can't do anything until this group
Right.
just, does its thing.
Yeah, and the planning board's a dynamic body.
Yeah.
The character changes with membership, and it reflects the community as the community changes and the population changes. So it could be, I mean, and by design, it's supposed to do that. It's a dynamic body that changes and represents the nature of the city as that changes. So they
Yeah.
can, I mean, ultimately, that's where this winds up, because that's the body that deals with that sort of thing.
Is there, are we pretty much
I
done
think so.
for this?
I think so.
I just, okay.
We're not pulling-
If there's any more members of the public who.
Did you want to add
share
anything
their-
today? You're the only one who hasn't had the.
I'd like to say that I would like to support looking carefully at Mr. Nash's proposal, that I think that has a lot of merit to it. I'm hearing a lot of concern that there's technical expertise on this committee, and perhaps to, sacrificing representation. And I think it's important to have the representation of different points of view, different agendas, different constituencies. From the standpoint of, you can always grow, learn, hire technical expertise. But if you just focus on technical expertise, you can end up with everybody coming from the same agenda, and you get 3/4 of the way down the road and you find out that that isn't where the city populace wants to go. So from that standpoint, I think, and the makeup of the group that he proposed seemed to me to be a workable size, not 50 and not 5. I know it's easier to get things done with small groups, but I think some of the function here is to be an interface to the public. That the planning board presumably has a fair amount of technical expertise, and the city is hopefully able to look after itself at some level. And this is an opportunity to get it out in front of the communities, to give all the different parties a voice, or a chance to express their voice, and hopefully spend the time up front instead of doing damage control later on.
Sure.
So,
Just to play devil's advocate a little bit, how would you feel if the representative from neighborhood associations was chosen from, say, the Bay State Association or the Lead Civic Association, as opposed to the Ward 3 Association?
I would be fine with that. I mean, that's part of the thing is obviously we can't have one from every organization, because you'd have organizations coming out of the woodwork. I would hope that whatever person got chosen was chosen because of their ability to look at community representation more generically, more, to reflect communities, not just their community, and also to see that the idea is to move things forward and not to be adversarial.
Yep. You two know there's this kind of Uber Civic Association now that's met 3 or 4 times at Florence Civic, so one vehicle might be to bring it to that body and have a couple of people.
Exactly.
If it goes that way. Yep.
Right.
Thanks.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for asking.
So, same time, same place?
Same time, same place.
Next week.
Same lack of refreshments.
Okay. And Ken will be here, so,
Yep.
okay.
Yep.
And we turn in our report, then we can have the refreshments.
There we go.
If we complete this, then maybe
Yeah,
Then we get
Major.
to have some treats.
Yeah.
I
If
have
I,
a feeling that's a few meetings off, but maybe
Yeah.
not.
yeah.